Welcome to St Peter's Church in Barton-Upon-Humber in Lincolnshire. It's the church here that was the first building to ever be identified as being from what we now know as the Anglo Saxon period. So we're going to be looking at the particular unique features that make up the Anglo Saxon style, but also the features that make Barton-Upon-Humber here unique as well, with the baptistry to the side of the tower. We're going to be seeing how it's expanded out during the Norman period and why it's ultimately shut down. My name is Chris, this is Church Searcher, and I'll see you after the map. So, I've left Yorkshire today, travelled south, across the border, over the Humber Bridge, onto the other side of the shore to Barton-Upon-Humber here. We're in Lincolnshire. Now it's that area north of the Humber that we know, in Anglo-Saxon terms, as the Kingdom of Northumbria, the Anglian kingdom up there. The kingdom to the south was known as Mercia, also an Anglian kingdom, but later it was conquered by Vikings and became known as the Five Boroughs, ruled by Jarls based out of Derby, Nottingham, Lincoln, Repton and Stamford. So in 1819 a man called Thomas Rickman came here. He was an architectural historian, and he had been busy categorising the various elements of Norman architecture and Gothic, particularly English Gothic architecture. And he wrote a work called An Attempt to Discriminate the Styles of English Architecture. So Thomas Rickman came here and realised straight away that the bell tower up on top there is of Norman architecture and Norman date. And he developed this notion called structural stratigraphy, whereby if there's something we know a particular date of, whatever is below that must therefore be earlier. And so this unknown architectural style here, he realised, must in fact be Anglo-Saxon. Now up until this point it had been believed that Anglo-Saxon architecture didn't really survive because it was believed they'd only really built in wood and using thatch. And he went throughout cataloguing the various aspects of this style, which we now recognise as Anglo-Saxon, and there's various aspects of it which we can point out here, and we've seen in other churches, particularly on our travels in Yorkshire. So the type of church here is called a turriform church. There's only 2 or 3 of these which actually survive as an example. And essentially a turriform church is formed of the nave actually being the ground floor of the tower, and there would have been a chancel off to the side in another cell built onto the side of the tower. Now the church here at St Peter's is unique in that there's also another cell on the side which is the baptistry, so that's where the font would have been. Now the chancel was knocked down in the Norman period and a new chancel was put on there, and then a new nave was essentially built just using the tower as a tower, ignoring the original nave, and going in the opposite direction, and a new chancel on the end of that. So the other turriform church is in Earl's Barton in Northamptonshire. That just has one cell, no additional baptistry like there is here. And then there's also another suggested turriform church at St Mary's in Broughton in Lincolnshire. Now these 3 churches are all within the Viking Danelaw, so it's suggested that the towers might have been built as defensive structures as part of these churches. You know, it's even suggested that on the very top of the original tower there was what's called a brooch spire, quite an unusual shape, that was then removed by the Normans when they put their belfry up on top. Now, one of the most obvious architectural features of the Anglo-Saxon style are the pilaster strips. These vertical bands going up, and they have these sort of arcades, either triangular arches or the rounded arches. So these create these features that are known as blank arcading, where you've got these arches or the triangular arches. They're just there for decorative purposes, and they're actually copying potential wooden architecture in their style. Now, the pilasters are made of Yorkshire gritstone, millstone grit, along with the quoins. And the quoins are the stones going up on the corners there, and they have the classic Anglo-Saxon long and short work, which means you've got alternating longer pieces of stone with smaller pieces. And they're also alternating in colour here as well on the corner quoins. Now, this gritstone has been identified as actually Roman in origin, which we've seen a lot up in the churches in Yorkshire, reused in these monumental churches. And we know it's Roman because there's various Roman features, like we've seen at Skipwith, for example, with the Lewis holes and dovetailed joints for iron fixings and fittings. So the rest of the tower and the baptistry here are made of Lincolnshire limestone, and they've got rendered rubble on there, as opposed to the Norman belfry, which stands out as being unrendered. Now, you can see behind me here that the door arch is triangular in form. There's also a rounded door arch on the other side, and then the windows are bifora in form. So there's two windows side by side, and they have another classic feature of Anglo-Saxon architecture, the baluster going up through the middle. And these are either moulded or they're turned on a lathe, and you can see the work on the baluster. And you also get a thinner, slightly less elaborate baluster, but more slender and longer on the Norman belfry up above as well. Now, these triangular arches are another specific feature of Anglo-Saxon architecture, along with string courses. And string courses are these thin rows of stone which you see on Anglo-Saxon towers, often separating the tower into several sections. And they're essentially designed to draw rainwater away from the stonework of the tower and down, whilst also being decorative features in their own right. Now, in the baptistry itself, there's a much bigger door arch in there, which is now all sealed up and rendered over. But you can see it's much bigger, much taller than the two arched doorways that are in the nave of the turriform tower. There's also two circular windows in the baptistry there, one letting light into the baptistry itself, another one higher up, interpreted possibly to be where there was a priest's room, or possibly even where there was a reliquary room, like we saw suggested at the church in Skipwith. So again, similar features at work in all of these Anglo-Saxon towers that we're seeing. Now, there's various dates suggested for the church and the tower here, from the early 11th century to the late 10th century. Now, the earliest date that's been given for the tower is 970 AD. Now, to put that into context, it was in the kingdom of Mercia here that King Peter converted to Christianity in 656 AD. It was shortly after that that Saint Chad, who was a Celtic Christian saint, and we'll be coming across him again in Yorkshire soon, he founded a monastery not far from here, part of the expansion of Celtic Christianity down beyond Northumbria, coming down into Mercia. Now, towards the end of the 9th century, around the 870s, the Vikings started raiding with the great heathen army. and the area was absorbed into the Danelaw, known as the Five Boroughs, centred on the Jarls who ruled out of Derby, Leicester, Lincoln, Nottingham and Stamford. The area was recaptured by Ethelflaed of Mercia along with Edward the Elder of Wessex in 916 and 917 and was ruled over by the Earls of Mercia until King Olaf of York reoccupied the whole area in 941 AD. It was then King Edward reconquered this area in 942, and that's all recorded in a poem in the Anglo Saxon Chronicles known as the Capture of the Five Boroughs. Now if we look in the Domesday Book here, it does mention Barton-Upon-Humber. Ulf has 13 carucates of land to the Geld. There's land for 27 ploughs, and it mentions that there is a church and a priest, along with 2 mills, a market and a ferry. And the ferry was probably the one which used to cross the Humber, which is now where the Humber Bridge is. Now the church here, we've seen the way it expanded out under the Norman period. And there were various periods of expansion, particularly in the 12th and 13th centuries, and you get this sort of English Gothic church being added on with a new nave and a new chancel at the far end. So effectively they're ignoring the design of this church, they're just using a tower. They've raised the tower up higher and have extended this massive church down the other way. Now about 100 or 200 metres to the west of here, there's another church called St. Peter's, and that was built in 1100 AD, initially as a chapel of ease for this one here. And it actually grew into a church of pretty much the same size and layout, and the two churches survived together until in 1972 this one was declared redundant because there was no need anymore for two churches of such a large size so close to each other. Now it's shortly after that that the archaeologists moved into this church, recognising the opportunity they had, because we've got this Anglo Saxon tower, Norman church features as well, and this early English Gothic church. So they were able to excavate the floor plans and see how exactly these churches grew and developed, but also the burials associated with them. And there's nearly 3,000 burials on this small plot of land here. And in particular, they had a lot of waterlogging on the site here. So a lot of the wood was preserved. So a lot of oak coffins survived, along with log burials. And these are logs that were hewn out into coffins with the bodies inside. There were even boat burials here, and about a dozen or so individuals who were mysteriously buried with hazel rods and staffs. Now the site here is currently managed and maintained by English Heritage, but it's at the moment closed to the public. If you look in the members book, it does list the site here, but if you go on the website, there's a little note saying it's currently closed while they decide how best to present it to the public. And it's the same with a few sites in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, unfortunately. So do double check before you go to some of these sites that they're going to be open. But here at Barton-Upon-Humber, a lot of the interest is actually on the outside of the building. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the architectural Anglo-Saxon style here in Anglian Mercia in Lincolnshire. You can visit the site, as I say, but do look out on the English Heritage website for news of when they're going to reopen this as well. Now, I hope to see you in the next video where we're going to be back in Yorkshire. So until next time, keep church searching.